thanks a lot for joining us, even if 4 p.m. and we know that Africa is a very niche topic. We were wondering how many people would have actually been here with us, but I think we are ready for it, and thanks again. So before starting this panel about investing in education in Africa, I want to quote Mandela, a beautiful quote that says, "The most powerful weapon we have to change the world is education." Mandela won't be proud of the diversity of our panel, but I'm sure that we will do our best to speak for an amazing continent, Africa. So before starting with our panelists, I want to give a little bit of context about Africa. So first of all, Africa is a continent and not a country. It's a continent bigger than China, India, US, and big part of Europe combined together. So when we talk about Africa, we talk about 54 different countries. 54 different countries with different language, with different religion, and with different history. There are often like running jokes about North Africa and South Africa are not considered Africa. That's like how far the diversity goes in the continent. So for this panel, I'm asking to our panelists and also to you to be more specific when we talk about Africa. So like, let's address like country by country, trying to understand like the context of the market we are talking about. Why education in Africa? I'm surprised that this is the only panel at the summit that is addressing Africa, and I hope that next year there's going to be like much more conversation and much more interest. And the reasons are very simple. Africa has the youngest population in the world, the fast-growing middle class, and by 2050, Africa will have 26% of the world working population. So how can we make sure that we are ready for it? Now, 80% of Africans have access to primary education, which is pretty good in comparison with like Latin American or some Asian country. But only 4 out of 100 people have access to high level of education. So how can we change that? So the conversation we're going to have today with this amazing panelist is about how on one side we can improve education without forgetting the job market. Because in a country like Ghana, for example, we have 150,000 graduates every year and only 5,000 jobs in the formal economy. How is this possible? How can we bridge the gap between like jobs creations and skills? So let's start with Audrey, who is the founder of Moringa School. Welcome, Audrey. Moringa School is based in Kenya. So just to give you an understanding, I just mentioned Ghana. Ghana is like on the west coast, and Kenya is like right at the opposite. How did you start Moringa School? What does Moringa School do? And which type of students do you have?
Yeah, definitely. Okay. So Moringa School, we are in the higher education space in Kenya, and also operating in 3 other countries, both in Africa, but also looking at Pakistan and Southeast Asia as well. We are essentially solving the problem in Kenya, or in Africa, that half of the 10 million graduates that graduate each year from African universities are unemployed. And a huge reason for that is the lack of skills and the lack of relevant content being taught in universities. And so currently we serve populations between 18 to 30. We have a 95% job placement rate, so really focused on both technical and soft skills, and ensuring that all of these students are getting into really meaningful employment.
Thank you. So we have like an example of how Moringa School, in a very small scale, is able to provide like the skills needed, because 95% of the students find jobs. And we have like any number about the salary that they get when they land on these jobs in comparison with other people.
Yeah. So generally on the African continent, I know we're not trying to generalize, but it takes about 4 years for a college graduate to actually find full-time employment upon graduation. And so in those 4 years, students generally work in internships before, again, like they're able to find full-time. And again, so our work at Moringa School is to shorten that gap. And also to ensure that these students are actually getting really high quality jobs. And so our average salary, and I know this is the US, so it's a very different environment, but the average salary of our graduates in Kenya is $500 a month, which is way higher than the national average, which is maybe something around like $70 a month. And so we're really focused on ensuring that students are getting high quality employment, and within 9 months to a year, their salary generally doubles in Kenya.
When did you start Moringa Connect, Moringa School? Moringa School, and did you raise money? So we can have like some parameters and we understand when we talk about Moringa School, how did you make all of this happen?
Sure. So we started Moringa School in April of 2014. And at that point, we chose to bootstrap the organization because in my previous role, I used to work in venture capital in Kenya. So we're investing in tech companies across the African continent, and generally the terms were not fantastic for African companies. And so we decided to actually build something that we thought that the market wanted and would pay for. And then now we're closing our round in a month with a couple of really fantastic local investors.
Wow, congratulations. So Moringa School is quite recent, and we heard that it's just about Kenya for now. But let's ask Nico, what does it take to start a Pan-African university?
I am the CEO of UNICAF, and UNICAF is operating in, we have a physical presence in 10 countries now in Africa. So we have blended learning, we have online, and we have partnerships with Western institutions like in the UK, plus we have our own institutions that have degree awarding powers in Africa. So we try to increase access to quality higher education through the provision of flexible delivery models. And we have up to now 15,000 students. And we think Africa is a great place to be. There's huge potential. Like it was mentioned earlier, the numbers are huge. I always give the example of Nigeria, where they have 1.7 million high school graduates every year, and there are only 500,000 seats at the public universities. So there's 1.2 million high school graduates without a chance to get into any university in Nigeria. So this is just one country, and there are 54 countries in the continent. 1.2 billion people in Africa, average age 19. So this is the age group that we think that we're after, and it's a huge potential.
It's very impressive because it doesn't happen often to hear about such an ambitious project. So can you tell us more about the countries that you're working in Africa, and how did you select them? Because on one side there are like big opportunities, but on the other one there are like big challenges. So can you tell us more about this?
Okay, we have students from all over Africa. However, our physical presence is in Nigeria and Ghana, Uganda, Kenya, Somalia, Uganda, Kenya, Somalia. Where else? Egypt is the only country we have in North Africa. We are in Malawi and in Zambia. So these are the countries where we have physical locations. We have a university branch in Malawi, we have one in Zambia, and we are ready to launch 3 more university sites in Uganda, Kenya, and Ghana.
So I guess, let me guess, your market number one and the one is doing better is Nigeria, right?
Yeah.
Which is not a surprise, but what's the difference between, let's say, entering like Malawi versus like Nigeria? What does it take?
Yeah, what you mentioned in the beginning is very important. That a lot of people think that when they talk about Africa, they consider that Africa is just the same anywhere you are, but there are huge differences. And you also have to consider this Francophone Africa, which is 120 million people, that are French speakers. And then you have huge differences in terms of culture, standards of living, conditions, technology level. So there are, the way you enter in a market like Malawi is very different than the way you would enter in a country like Nigeria. Of course, when it comes to operating a university, you have to also consider the regulations, which again, they're very different. So each time you launch an operation in one of these countries, it's a brand new project and is not related to anything else you did in another African country, completely different.
how exactly UNICAF works, because there are already in place like public and private universities. So what's like the value that you're bringing to Africans that otherwise they wouldn't have access to?
We have, as I mentioned in the beginning, we have partnerships with Western institutions. For example, we have a partnership with the University of South Wales in the UK. So as an example, you have a Nigerian student who is studying through us and gets a degree from a British university. The degree, even though we're teaching this fully online, the degree is identical to a degree that they would get if they were taught in Wales. And the big difference is that we offer this opportunity at a very low cost. So the price of an MBA in the UK is now about £12,000. We're offering exactly the same degree with only £3,000 to African students. So we think we are the only opportunity they have to be able to earn such a degree at such a low cost. And this not only allows them to get a better job, it also helps companies to go set up operations in Africa because they know they can find qualified people with qualifications they recognize. So most governments, they appreciate the fact that we set up operations in their countries because not only we help with increasing access to higher education, we also create jobs and we also create opportunities for investment in those countries. Recently we were in Malawi, for example, and the president of Malawi called a meeting. There were 7 ministers just to talk about what we are doing in that country.
So when we talk about Africa, we often address the infrastructural challenges that implies, especially like connectivity-wise. But last year I was walking, I live between Washington, D.C. and Accra in Ghana, and I was walking in the dark, and next to an open sewer, there was like a mom carrying like a 2-year-old baby at the back, in the dark. And I turned my head and I see that the baby was holding a phone on the back of the mom. So you see like this light, the light of the phone on the face of the baby. And I thought like, this is the future. Like we have like open sewer, but yet everyone has at least one phone. So how does online university works in Africa? How do they access content through like mobile or computers? Can you help us to picture this?
Yeah. I mean, obviously there are a lot of challenges in working in Africa, not only in education, but in other sectors as well. To give you an example, in Malawi, this time of the year, you probably, there's no electricity for most of the day. So you go to the office at 9 in the morning and there is no electricity until 7 at night. So nobody's working, everybody's sitting around doing nothing. And you have to have a generator and petrol and the rest of it. So we designed our systems so that they are mobile friendly because most people will access the virtual learning environment through their mobile phones. And we also make it possible that they can download the material so they can read it offline. So this helps them to study even when they don't have connectivity to the internet. So there are a lot of challenges relating to the technology, but you have to consider there's a huge investment taking place in Africa now to increase internet access and electricity for most countries. So year after year, we see a huge difference in that respect.
Speaking of investment, right on your left, there's Daniel, he is one of your investors. So Daniel, can you tell us from a Western perspective, what are the opportunities that you see in Africa? And why did you invest in companies like UNICAF?
So I'm an accidental African investor. I did not intend to invest in Africa. My wife still thinks I'm crazy. And I had the pleasure of now understanding, though, what it means to light up a continent. Right now, if you think about the level of education throughout Africa, and we solve big problems in education. So University Ventures, we have about $350 million under management, focused exclusively on solving big problems in the talent economy and education. And we had the pleasure in investing in a business in Cyprus, which is another long story. And there's this crazy guy named Nicolaou who always has these big, amazing visions for like going to North Korea and selling them education. And one day he comes and says, I'm getting a lot of leads from Africa. And we're like, whatever, fine. Here's $100,000. Go see if you can, market to African students. And within a very short period of time, the cost per start went from a big number to a manageable number, and students were enrolling. And I was shocked. I thought Nico was crazy. I still think he's crazy, but for other reasons. No one chuckled. Is anybody awake here? That was a funny line, people. But what I saw was just this vast hunger. And I think what really hit me was when the Ebola crisis hit, and Nico showed us at a board meeting. Someone literally had written in like, "I'm really sorry, not my dog ate my homework, but my whole village has Ebola and I can't get my internet working." And like, that's just a level of desire that we don't have to face here in this country. And so it's really inspiring, first of all. I also, as a investor, have to make sure the numbers work and that we can get a scaled return here. And while you can have, on one hand, sort of a passion for something like figuring out how to educate people in the environments that Nico and Audrey and others are operating in, which is very difficult. And the numbers in Africa are clearly there. And so the question then becomes, is there a reasonable way to access that and provide a service at a price that works? And so I think you need to be really, really creative. Like, I don't think this is easy. I think this is really, really hard, the work that any entrepreneur who tells you they're going to start a business has a degree of difficulty in front of them that is extraordinarily difficult. And then to layer on that, 54 countries, no internet, flights don't work. I mean, it's really hard. I was just with Nico on this trip to Malawi, and we got stopped in customs. And I'm like, oh my God, we're getting stopped in customs. What's going on? I'm scared. You know what? They recognized Nico, they recognized UNICAF, and they wanted admission to the university. That doesn't happen on my other visits to other portfolio companies. And so, thank you for laughing. Appreciate that. I think on one hand, this is a passion project of mine to some extent, but it's also something that I think, and this is a conversation you and I had, like, I think there's a reason why there aren't big investors operating in Africa. I think it's really hard. I think it's hard to make the numbers work. And so I hope you're right that next year or even 5 years from now, there are more people who come to a panel like this. But unfortunately, I think it's going to be really hard. We're investors in another business that you're familiar with called Shortlist, which is doing great. But I mean, the scale, it's one of the best known startups in education in Africa. And it doesn't have the scale that someone like Nico has, and it's really hard to find scaled opportunities in this space.
How many investors we have in the room today? Raise your hand. We can do better, but I think we are like one step forward for having this conversation about education in the nonprofit world. We are here because there are, like, as you said, like numbers attached to educations. Yeah. So let's try to size a little bit more like these opportunities and how leapfrogging education in Africa means like a good deal for investors. Julie, would you like to tell us more about all the different ideas and models that investors can use to invest in education in Africa?
Yeah, thank you. And I want to second the notion that next year the panel should look a little different. Not that we're not all doing interesting work on the ground, but still. I think I would take a couple steps back as a backdrop to the great work that everybody is talking about here to say that I think the issues and themes and trends and challenges discussed over these 3 days here are as relevant, if not more so, on the African continent, as significant, if not more so, on the African continent. When you start looking at the inputs, factors that exist on the continent, and you start talking about things that better connect people to employability, new types of vocational training, micro-credentialing, micro-learning, liberation of learning, lifelong learning, knowledge workers instead of teachers. you can track and correlate that in an African context in extremely, extremely powerful ways. So I'm a big fan of saying that I think Africa can shape the future of learning as much as Cincinnati, Ohio, or anywhere else in the world, and that we all need to start being part of a narrative that says, stop investing in things that we now acknowledge at this conference have failed. And I think we are at risk, we being the wider ecosystem, investors and not, of championing the growth and the numbers that are going to happen on the continent, but potentially continuing to back and invest in traditional models that we know have failed elsewhere. And I don't think that the African continent should have to wait 30 years for Silicon Valley to figure out the things that are being discussed at this conference. So I'm a big proponent of that. I think the other dynamic, just to get to your question, is that we are now watching a situation in which there's going to be a radically different role of the private sector in education in Africa than's been known to date. So traditionally it is considered and thought about and not looked at favorably by the majority of people in development, that private sector is for the wealthy only, and that is radically breaking apart as we now acknowledge, and they acknowledge, that the public sectors cannot deliver anymore. They can't do it from a capacity perspective, bricks and mortar can't do this anymore, et cetera. So you're going to start to see, which gets to the opportunities, a changing role of a private sector that's more about innovation and disruption, and that's more about solutions that increase access, affordability, quality, and relevance for all segments of the pyramid and not just the rich, which is going to be super exciting. And then the final thing to your point is that, the leapfrogging, the continent's well known for it. It's a leader in it. So lack of legacy systems. Kenya announced 3 weeks ago they bypassed Nigeria 83% on smartphones. Yeah. Better 4G networks than a lot of America. Rapid urbanization. So, and as you said, largest youth population, largest youth workforce, fierce demand for skilled talent. So if anybody's been to look at the migration in Africa, it's what they call pressure from the back, right, to cross the river. And that you're going to start seeing that happening. So financial services, M-Pesa, off-grid energy, M-Copa, pay-as-you-go solar. Not only can you pay as you go solar, but you can now do your credit, improve your credit rating and your credit score. So all these non-banked finance solutions are going to mash up with ed tech. So it's just a matter of time, but it's going to be harder. And I think that it's an early pipeline. I think there's a bit of ed tech exuberance that isn't completely grounded in reality yet. But that, we're focused on a number of white spaces, which we could talk about later.
So when we are, as you just mentioned, we are still early stage in this type of space and this type of investment. I remember this quote from Dave McClure when he started 500 Startups, and he said, "We are all about small bets," which helps to bridge the gap between the risk and the opportunity. So this is for Daniel and Julie. What do you think are the small bets that investors can make today in Africa? And maybe double down 2 years from now?
First of all, it is absolutely absurd that Audrey came to my office in New York to raise money. You talk about crazy. I don't know how many miles away you are, and I basically said and I think your approach of bootstrapping was 100% right. I cannot begin to tell you how many business plans I get about things in Africa, and it is absolutely absurd that me in New York, who doesn't even have an Africa focus, gets probably a business plan a week. Why, and so to some extent, yes, we can say, look, Western, I should not be investing in Africa. The panel should look different. Yeah, hell yeah, the panel should look different, partially because I don't know, I'm the worst person to understand what is needed in Africa. I grew up on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, okay? But beyond that, capital markets should develop around big opportunities like this. And the fact that they're not indicates that we have, capital should be flowing to good ideas. And I think part of the reason, I think there's I'm not an expert enough to say why that doesn't develop, but I'll just leave by saying, if there's anybody in this room trying to figure out how to back African venture capital and other small bets is a lot more important than figuring out how to put a couple $100,000 in Audrey's business. I think, which is a very good business and we should all back, but figuring out how to get money in local venture and early stage growth companies through GPs based there, I think would be a real huge win. Sorry, I'm not sure that was the answer you were looking for.
Oh, well, we are here to have a conversation. So your perspective is very different from Julie's perspective, I guess, because you are based in Nairobi. And so you have like more understanding of what's happening on the ground, and maybe you can have like more confidence on like writing these checks or understanding who can be the right companies.
I mean, we're definitely starting to see an emerging pipeline that tells us what the future of learning can look like, and I don't think we've seen anything yet. Some characteristics, if you're asking investors or directing them where to start looking, I think the majority of the innovation and disruption that can bring about exponential change instead of incremental change, which is what the continent needs if it's going to close the 100-year gap, is going to be out of school. So, I mean, I guess I would say to investors, widen your lens of learning, not just education. It's going to be out of school. It's going to be for adults. I think that a lot of the stuff I'm seeing is successfully able to regionally scale, which is great news despite the challenges. So we could go through, I think educational media and content's super exciting. I think education to employability, what Audrey's doing, mini general assemblies and beyond. We're seeing a lot of mobile, personalized learning for adults that would really surprise you in terms of how sophisticated it is, yet it's contextualized for local poor audiences at scale. And then one of the ones I'm extremely excited about in terms of ancillary stuff is education finance. And I was head of innovation for the Bank of the Poor for the last 4 years, so I know, they're not lending. And so I think there's huge opportunity for restacking how people get finance that really takes into account the financial habits of the poor. And we could talk a lot more about that.
I just want to echo that. I think as an investor, you have to be open, especially in Africa, things that just are totally orthogonal to what your understanding is. I'll give you a crazy example. We've developed, and we have one of the great Bitcoin leaders in the room, actually, partially because we started having people from places like Africa say they wanted to pay for higher education in Bitcoin. And that's one of those things where you look at and you're like, this is in, by the way, 2013, okay? So in 2013, people in Africa start, partially because what Nico was doing, they're saying, hey, it's costing us 10% to send you money from Nigeria. Can we pay you in Bitcoin? And we're like, we're in Cyprus, we're accepting payment for tuition in donkeys. Well, in 2013, there was a huge financial crisis in Cyprus. And of course, we'll accept Bitcoin. And I got a huge amount of press for that, and actually developed into now 4,000 students in a MOOC around digital currency, and totally influenced our core operation in Cyprus. And I think to your point, Julia, you need to be open to those things. The stuff that comes out of Africa is not going to make sense to you, and that's okay. And just run with it. The learnings you will have are going to be radically different. Personally, it's been incredibly valuable to me. Stepping out of my comfort zone and just saying okay, fine, we'll accept Bitcoin. What does that mean now? I mean, I think that to your point, you're going to see a lot of orthogonal, non-traditional things pop out that are worth pursuing.
So I've been living in Silicon Valley for 8 years, and everyone talks about unicorns here, unicorns there. And when I moved to West Africa, I started reevaluating the concept of unicorn, because you see amazing startups where they are up and they work just because of the determination of the founders. And as Audrey said, bootstrapping is already hard in the US. So imagine when you are in an environment that is very adverse and the funding is very limited. It's so hard to make things happen. But then those companies that have strong business model and can make it and can survive, that's what I call real unicorn. So Audrey, can you tell us about how your business model works and how you're being able to bootstrap? Because I'm really interested to talk about the commercial model of startups in Africa.
Yeah, for sure. I think startups on the continent have a tendency to raise money extremely early. Just because I think young entrepreneurs that I used to work with during my investor days, they would often kind of see like, oh, grant funding, or like investor money, oh, I've made it, instead of thinking of it as a way to continue to grow their companies. And so when we started Moringa School, we had a sort of a different mentality on how do we actually ensure that we're meeting a market need, right? Instead of having investors or donors like telling us, oh, okay, like you need to do X, Y, and Z, when that's actually not a way to actually build a company. And so with Moringa School, we do charge tuition. And so when we started, we thought of it from like the higher end market, like, and working our way down. And so we targeted the like middle class and I guess upper class initially to start. But then like this year, a lot of our work is around our Access program. So thinking about ISAs. So it's just at a really fantastic ISA panel. And so thinking more about ISAs, how they work in our context, especially when credit scoring, like there's a lot of issues with decentralization of data in Kenya and all these other markets we're working in. And then, so this year we're charging, we're giving students the options of taking ISA. So we're working with students from like the slums and really understanding like their learning profile and how that matches to like our current program that currently serves like middle and upper income students. Yeah, I don't know if that answers the question.
And your students, so I guess we all have heard about Andela and how Andela is trying to create talents to fulfill like American needs. What's the goal of your students? Are they looking forward to stay in the country, to build a company, to find a job? What do they do with these skills?
So the way we look at our program as opposed to Andela's is that we are sort of like the undergraduate degree, and then Andela is the graduate degree. So currently Andela takes probably like the top, like, I don't know, like 0.0 something % of African talent and trains them up from like a pretty significant amount of skill to be able to meet the, I guess, US demand. And for us, we're thinking a lot about serving more like the local economy. And so starting, of course, low-hanging fruit with computer science, moving into a lot of other skills like cybersecurity and other skills that employers are looking for on the continent.
Wow, it's very inspiring to picture how local education at some point will be able to complete the cycle and feel like the local needs of the African market. Nico, would you like to tell us also about your business model and how it's been so far?
So we, as I described earlier, we have two operations. One is fully online, the other one is blended. The challenge in Africa, of course, is the fees. So you have to be very flexible with payments, and students, typically they would pay a small deposit and then they will make monthly payments. So a lot of the students, they would take one module and then wait for a period of time until they accumulate enough money and they take another. So for a typical student to finish a master's degree would take them something like 4 years. So you have to structure your financial models taking that into consideration. And I don't think there is a model where you don't allow students to follow these small payment plans. We received funding in 2016. We have as one of our investors the Development Finance Institution of the UK government, and we have University Ventures. So we are fortunate in that respect, and that helped us accelerate our operations and our efforts, and that's how we expanded throughout Africa. So in terms of the financials of the company, we think that this is a business that needs to scale up very quickly, and because it's based on large numbers, and that's why we have plans now to expand in 5 additional countries in the next 3-4 years. So this is how we structure the business.
Yeah, actually, one of them, Andela, I love Jeremy, and I've known him for years, and I love what Andela is doing. But, and you see this in certain emerging markets. You see, not emerging like in Africa or other, but in areas where you have like General Assembly or some others, just suck all the oxygen out of the room because, Andela has gotten so much, it's been on Facebook, it's been, as part of the Nigerian election campaign, and all of which is incredibly good and important. But when I tell people that UNICAF has 15,000 students in it, their jaws just drop. And I think the general community around Africa does a really poor job of identifying and supporting their champions. I mean, every single development bank, every single person involved in the African continent should be backing UNICAF as, and 3 or 4 other people who are getting to that scale. Because it's so rare. You need not just one success story, because someone can write off and say, oh, Andela's serving the US market, or, whatever the, or Bridges is another one that everyone kind of talks about. But in order to actually create the ecosystem, you need like 10 companies. You need to be, if I were sort of trying to promote investment in Africa, I'd be like, and look at UNICAF, and look at this, and look at that. And the problem is it may not be that the bench is so deep, but the critical thing is to create that ecosystem of investors around stories of success.
Yeah, I would just second that. I have to say, I think Andela, Bridge, and Get Smarter out of South Africa are sort of the big ones everybody talks about, and I think they've paved the way, especially Bridge, with all the controversy. I think you have to give it to them in terms of ambition and hard work and success in many respects. And if you now look at the numbers of low-cost private schools who've been inspired by what they've done coming up across the continent, it is pretty extraordinary. And if you look at what they're doing in Liberia, which is essentially the beginning of the American charter school movement in Africa, it's pretty extraordinary. So I think we have to give it to them, but I do think there is partially because of what you're saying, which is the external investor interest, there's a herd mentality around a handful. And so I think certainly what we're trying to do, and hopefully others, is to widen that ecosystem. I think that the other 2 things I would just say, governments are threatened by all of this, so they're not going to champion it. I mean, I've been in meetings where there have been discussions about why doesn't Kenya take credit for Bridge like they take credit for M-Pesa, but they're totally threatened by it. And when Bridge comes out and announces results that are twice as good as the government's, everybody goes quiet. I do think that there's a need for it, and I sort of what I'm seeing, and you're the fund, and I'm not really a fund, even though we call ourselves a fund, but I think there are more creative, need for more creative players to help generate pipeline, and I don't think it's Y Combinators or incubators or challenge contests, and I don't think necessarily the early stage fund structure is the best for helping this ecosystem grow. I think we need a combination
How should we grow the ecosystem?
Well, I think personally, I think we are finding it by being on the ground, but we're finding stuff that funds wouldn't touch.
Right.
So I just spent a year doing a $3 million capital raise for what's going to become Africa's first children's education digital network. Former Nickelodeon Scholastic executives. It'll be on the air in 6 months, broadcasting to 16 million children who make up 42% of the television audience in Kenya. And if you think poor people don't have televisions, you're wrong. And not only do they have televisions, they have digital set-top boxes because the country's moved to. So the impact of that, the numbers of that, the scale of that, but no fund would touch it. They thought the advertising market wasn't there. They had every reason in the world. So I'd say something that can be a bit riskier and creative.
So where did you raise the money from? I'm
but,
sorry.
But also something that can bring ideas from here into local context, because I don't think we're going to see fast enough the creation of a local pipeline. We raised the money from Kenyan investors.
That's awesome.
Totally awesome.
So Julie, I'm very intrigued right now to understand more about this company that you mentioned. Can you give us more insights about some of your portfolio companies, if possible?
So the mobile learning is much different than I would have expected and more sophisticated. So I've been working with a company that's now doing personalized learning to adults at the bottom of the pyramid in ways that is very sophisticated. We're seeing patterns whereby it's like night school. So adults are going onto this platform to learn subjects 28, 30 levels down, all between the hours of like 7 and 10 o'clock at night. And what it's doing is really conveying and teaching important information about employability and livelihoods, so better farming, et cetera. You've heard all the stories, but what we're starting to see is that the users of this platform are buying 5 times more seeds, or they're opening this many new financial services or products. So who's going to pay for that? Banks, Syngenta, Monsanto. It's a really extraordinary movement into what it looks like to see digital learning via mobile, et cetera. So that's one that's really going gangbusters. They'll move into a Series A next year. I'm working with another mobile that you talk about out of the margins. So 60% of rural Africa is illiterate. So for all of our optimism about 4G and smartphones, 60% of rural Africa is illiterate. They're going backwards and using unused 2G networks, which the mobile operators don't care about, to do voice teaching or IVR teaching. They claim they're going to be the first unicorn in Africa. Huge investor interest.
So I'm a personal investor in a business in the Philippines, which I know is not Africa, but sorry. But what it does is at kiosks around the country. So outside of the Manila, you basically don't have connectivity. Don't have literacy. But everyone, if you've ever been to any of these places, like they have television. It's really remarkable. But they don't have television when they're in transit. So this guy, another wonderful entrepreneur, is putting kiosks like Coke machines in every bus stop has a place where you buy like your bus ticket and maybe a drink for your hour-long bus ride. And he's put kiosks there where you can upload content onto your phone. And I think like everybody wants to buy it because you're sitting on a bus. If you've never been to a developing country, your transportation is a real like getting from point A to point B is a long process. And the biggest thing that people want to put on their iPhones for their transportation or their phones for transportation is educational content, right after the Spanish telenovelas. But it's growing like a weed, and there's such a, again, it comes back to this like thirst and demand. And we in the West do a really poor job of like understanding that people consume their content differently. They're looking for different experiences because they don't have the money, the resources, whatever, but the demand is still very much there. And I think when Nicos told me what he was doing, I was like, this is crazy. Who's going to buy a degree for $2,000 in a hybrid environment in Africa? Like, that doesn't, And then, you start reading these stories and it's very compelling. Like, everyone who's at a middle market bank or works for the government, we have like vice ministers of education taking PhDs because that doesn't exist in the countries where we're operating in countries like Somalia and others.
Next month, we heard this morning that next month Starbucks is going to shut down 8,000 stores to teach how to deal with, to teach their managers how to deal with bias. So at this point, after hearing these very interesting solutions, I wonder what would happen if in countries like the US, we import some of these ideas to teach to people who are already like employed. Simple things like how to deal with bias or just like upgrade their skills. That would be like a fun things to see. We have 5 minutes left. I would like to hear from Audrey and Nico, 2030. Where would you like, what would you like to see? Where do you think you will be and how things will change by then?
Cool. Well, I've been answering first, so if you'd like to go first. Go for it.
Okay. So 2030.
2030.
Okay.
Or 2025? Maybe that's 2030 is too far?
Well, it makes a big difference.
How big is our exit going to be, Nico? Are we going to be billionaires? What's the deal?
So I think if you look at the data about Africa, it's possible to have 1 million students studying online or through blended learning and have operations in 20 countries. So I think this is how we can really, distribute to the wider public what we are doing, what we are offering, and obviously you have to do this at a price point that is acceptable to the people in Africa.
How do you expect have you draw like how the price point will change? What's the percentage of the price point change in the next?
Well, I think it's more of a challenge that we are able to offer quality higher education at a low cost, so we can charge less rather than increasing our costs and transferring that cost to the students. So I think that's the challenge. We have to be very innovative in being able to operate and offer what we're offering at a very low cost. That's the only way that you can really expand in Africa.
What about you, Audrey? What Moringa School will look like? You can pick 2025 or 2030.
I have such a big range to pick from. Thank you. Yeah, so I mean, we just did our 5-year planning, so this is coming at a good time. So I guess for Moringa School, we have a pipeline of over 100 partners from around the world that are just purely inbound requests that want us to bring Moringa School into their respective countries. And so these could be like Bangladesh, they could be Uganda, they could be Rwanda, South Africa. So really across the world, mostly in emerging markets. And so for us, we see huge opportunity right now because there's so much interest and so much demand for the kind of education that we're providing, right? Which is blended, very low cost, but also highly effective, right? So getting young people into jobs, which I think is the key kind of quality outcomes metric that we track. And so for us, in the next 5 years, we do have ambitions for our secondary school program, which is more of an introduction program, to train over 50,000 students in all the markets that we operate in. This year, we're scaling into 5 new markets around the world, so not necessarily just on the African continent. And so in 5 years, I'm sure that will be many more.
Daniel, are you planning to invest again in 2019 in Africa?
Check, please. No, I think one thing I've learned, and I think I would like in 2 to 3 years to raise a fund focused on the emerging markets. If you look at the demographics, but I mean, look, it is irrational for me to fly from New York City to Malawi on any kind of regular basis. It is not. There's no rational reason for me to do that. And we need to be operating, if we're going to invest more in Africa, and we'll do little things, whatever, but if we're going to invest more in Africa, we're going to open an office in Nairobi or Dubai or something that is sort of closer. But I think it is really about building the ecosystem locally. It is not the right move for people in New York to be leading investments in Africa. And I don't know what your perspective is, but if I'm right or wrong, but.
There's some good people leading investments in Africa, but yes, I hear you. I mean, I think if I had to look forward, I think a couple of things. The gap and the need and the opportunity is so big that I think, first of all, you're going to see more greenfield opportunities than you might otherwise. I also think that one thing we haven't discussed, but there's huge opportunity, I think, for employers to get involved in education in a way that will be a leapfrogging experience on the continent. But I guess back to the early stage piece, I think the continent's so big, the opportunity is so big, the pipeline is so early. I don't think it's a matter of just waiting around for an African pipeline, African technologies to all of a sudden meet this opportunity. So I do believe that there's a sort of mashup in which we can look for ways to help accelerate the future of learning by exposing and bridging an imagination gap for a continent that has been told not to imagine what this looks like. And so if we can combine some of what the discussion is here with then more creative early risk-taking investment that can do greenfield opportunities, et cetera, I think we'll have a magic touch.
Yeah, I just point out, we have a medical school that powering medical schools around the world, and I'd like to build 10 medical schools in Africa. I can do that from New York, and I think that those types of opportunities are really, really important.
Great, amazing. It would be lovely to meet you all next year and catch up with the progress.
Next year in Africa.
Next in Africa.